Hi, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Fellows lectures. My name is Marcelo Gleiser. I'm a professor of physics and astronomy at Dartmouth College, and I'm also directing the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement, which is the host for this event, and was the host for an event we had a few days before on the future of society, which included Her Excellency Joyce Banda, the past president of Malawi, and Pastor Barry Randall from Detroit. And all our events are recorded and are stored in our database, which you can find at ice.dartmouth.edu. So you're welcome to come and check the more than 50 hours of videos of past speakers, public dialogues, interviews that we have been accumulating over the years. But today I am very happy to introduce our current resident fellow, who is Professor Matthew Nisbet. He's a professor of communication, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University. And he's also a monthly columnist at Issues in Science and Technology magazine. He studies the process by which the public and decision makers come to understand complex scientific and technological issues, analyzing the influence of ideas, politics, expertise, and culture. So extremely timely issues right now, given that all the conflicts that we have between science and policy in this country and in other countries. And of course, during the pandemic, this conversation becomes even more fundamental. He is the author or co-author of more than 80 peer-reviewed studies, scholarly book chapters and reports, including the 2019 American Academy of Arts and Sciences report, The Public Face of Science Across the World, and the 2018 American Association for the Advancement of Science report on Science in Civic Life, Facilitating Dialogue-Based Communication, and the 2017 US National Academy's Consensus Studies on Communicating Science Effectively, a Research Agenda. Clearly, we have a lot of work to do on that front, given the anti-scientific climate that we live in. He is actually working on a book that he will tell you about, and it is very pertinent to our lecture today. And in fact, I'm not going to talk about everything that he has done. He's done a wonderful, he's an extremely busy person, has a very, very wonderful curriculum. He also, of course, was a Dartmouth alum, class of 1996, and he graduated from the government department. So we're very happy to have him back home, so to speak. And today he's going to talk about the quiet mind, science, culture, and contemplation in a post-pandemic world. So let us all welcome Matt silently, but together, so that he can start his conversation. Okay, Matt, the floor is yours.
Okay, so it's great to be back here at Dartmouth College. When I was an undergrad and when I graduated, I never in my wildest dreams thought I would be coming back on sabbatical as a professor to visit campus. And I never also imagined that I'd be coming back not only as a professor but to talk about the topics of meditation, yoga, and Stoicism, which at the time I had barely any awareness or knowledge of or experience with. And when I look back on my time at Dartmouth and I think about institutions today, that time, Dartmouth did what higher education is supposed to do. It really molds and informs you. And that liberal arts education, it prepares you to move into things that you never even anticipated you would move into, careers, directions, research, interests, rather than training you in a specialized way. And among some of the really formative experiences I had as an undergrad, one of those things was my freshman writing seminar, which I took a course called Scientists as Writers. It was taught in the chemistry department. And I'd always had an interest in the intersection between science, culture, and politics. Also, not only around sort of the big questions related to science and culture. I was a huge reader and avid fan of Carl Sagan and other scientists at the time, but also looking at emerging environmental problems and environmental issues. And that's why I had certificate in environmental studies. But it was from that class and then moving forward, I always wanted to be a writer, and I wrote for the Dartmouth newspaper. But as I graduated and majored in American politics and government, I had a real interest in environmental policy, environmental issues. I took a environmental toxicology course, actually, another course I never thought I would take. But that really turned me on to these very complex, uncertain risk questions around emerging technologies. And after college, I worked for a time at a think tank at the University of Buffalo. I grew up outside of suburban Buffalo, near the University of Buffalo, called the Center for Inquiry. Publishes two magazines, Skeptical Inquirer and Free Inquirer magazine. And it was founded by people like Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov, and back in the 1970s. And Paul Kurtz was a philosopher, a secular humanist philosopher there. And it was through that experience that I started to really think about the important relationship between science, communication, and the media, and public understanding. And so I worked there for about 2 years as I tried to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I came across the graduate program at Cornell University in the PhD program in communication. And when I went there, it was the ideal environment because I was able to mix, I'm trained as a quantitative social scientist studying the influences on public opinion, particularly media effects, but also situational effects such as social norm perceptions. But I also mixed that with a lot of courses in science and technology studies, the philosophy of science, natural resources policy. And at the time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was one of the first researchers moving into studying the many emerging politicized science debates that we have, and applying various different disciplinary tools and frameworks to understand them. And I've always been I was talking about this with Marcelo on our walk. I've always been a fox rather than a hedgehog. And most academics are hedgehogs, meaning they really drill in deep into one specialty. But I've always had a range of interests. And so it was a unique environment to be able to do that from an interdisciplinary standpoint. And I started studying the debates over food biotechnology and embryonic stem cell research. And really, those debates were, most people think of those debates as science issues, but they're really debates over political control, morals, and values, where scientific uncertainty or the promise of science really becomes sort of rhetorical footballs for people to argue on behalf of their political goals and their values. And so I started doing large-scale public opinion studies of how the public, how knowledge about, for example, stem cell research or food biotech varies by, people's attitudes about, say, embryonic stem cell research varies by their ideology or the religious values, regardless of how much their level of scientific literacy. So in my studies, I was one of the first researchers to show that, as most social scientists would tell you, but we didn't really have a lot of empirical evidence of it, that technical knowledge of science only has a very weak relationship to people's policy attitudes, or whether or not they think an issue like a technology like food biotechnology or embryonic stem cell research should even move forward, whether it should be banned or scientists should be allowed to work in that area. Rather, people use their knowledge and their levels of education in a process called motivated reasoning to selectively interpret and apply their background knowledge to only accept and argue on behalf of the facts that meet with their goals. And we're starting to see that in the early 2000s, especially around some of the politicization around embryonic stem cell research, which ultimately was a ethical question and a policy question whether to fund it or not, where science was one factor among many in that decision. But then we really started to see it later in the decade around climate change. And so while I started looking at things like genetic engineering early in my career, I really focused the last decade or so on climate change. And as I moved to continuing to look at things like the role of media coverage on policy outcomes and also public opinion, how the public makes sense of these issues, I became involved in a lot of applied research around how to communicate about these issues effectively. So I ended up working with a lot of different organizations like the American Association for the Advancement of Science and serving on this consensus study committee with the National Academies of Sciences in this area that is now called the science of science communication. How can we apply social science to effectively communicating about these complex science issues? But along in the process, I also became really interested, not just observing this, working in Washington, D.C., where I was on the faculty at American University, that some of the very same biases or processes that were influencing the general public were also influencing how decision makers understand these issues and the decisions they make. Everyone from elected officials to think tank and NGO staff, to including also philanthropists and funders, as well as journalists. So the last, really the last 5 or 6 years, I've been looking at those elite level influences and doing studies examining the decisions of major foundations, for example, and how they define climate change as a social problem and what they invested in terms of political strategies and technologies. But also this book that I just sent off for review at Harvard University Press looks at the role that public intellectuals play in defining some of the biggest questions of the moment. These questions such as what is a wickedly complex issue like climate change or pandemics or sort of the domination of big tech in our lives? Not only what does it mean scientifically, but most importantly, what does it mean philosophically, religiously, spiritually? So the book is called The Meaning Makers, Public Intellectuals in a World of Risk, and it'll be out next fall. Everything goes to plan. I always try to use my sabbaticals as kind of a transformative moment. So it was back in 2012, my last sabbatical, before I left American to go to Northeastern, that I really shift gears to start to look at, say, the influence of philanthropy on public problems and the influence of public intellectuals. And so in this sabbatical, I'm also trying to use it as a transformative moment. Just try to apply my insights and my tools and the methods I've used over the years, and also learn about new disciplines and new fields, and also in sort of the style of writing that I've been developing is more of a public intellectual style of writing, to do a new book now, looking at the emergence over the last 15 years of contemplative practices, particularly mindfulness meditation, that comes out of the Buddhist tradition, yoga, and then, and somewhat uniquely, also looking at the diffusion and the growing popularity of Stoicism. And so if I start to, let's see here. All right, so if we think about the present moment, we're in this moment of intense uncertainty, like nothing obviously I've seen in my 45 years of life, probably nothing we've really seen. People compare it to 1968, but I think you have to go back to World War II and the Great Depression. And things are happening so incredibly quickly. That's the other thing about the world that we live in right now. Not only are we looking at this new class of problems like pandemics, which policy scholars call wicked problems, and that they're not conventional problems. They really have no clear end or solution. And they span geographies and continents, and they affect people across class, and they're scientifically complex. They have no single cause, and they have really no single solution. Even experts disagree over what kind of problem a pandemic is. Is it an innovation problem to develop vaccines, or is it a public health system problem, or is it a combination of both? And so I was reflecting on the idea that just as of May 24th, the New York Times headlined its Sunday newspaper and then online with obituaries from across the country to mark sort of the grim milestone that we had passed 100,000 deaths from the pandemic. And what's amazing to think back to then is from March, basically American life in a matter of weeks completely transformed. And probably permanently. No one can say for sure. And we lived during this moment of 3 months where 100,000 Americans died in a span of 3 months. But only 3 days later, after this headline at the New York Times, was the George Floyd killing and death in Minneapolis, where a video of that killing by the police officer as he kneeled on his neck really, pushing the life out of him. That video was then posted that night onto Facebook, and within 24 hours, almost everyone in the country had seen it. And hundreds of thousands of people, actually millions of people over the next several weeks, poured into hundreds of cities and towns across the country to protest police violence. And so in just a turn of the dime, right? So history had shifted so quickly in a matter of weeks in March, from talking about issues like climate change or other policy problems, or just going about our lives, to the pandemic. And then in a matter of 24 hours, then another huge historical tsunami hits life at a time when everyone was completely staring at spending even more of their time on screens, right? And that was one of the reasons why the George Floyd killing had such a big impact. And now, as we move into this period of time where there's so much uncertainty around the election in November, about the outcome, whether our institutions are up to the moment. Now we're seeing the wildfires in California. We're seeing yet another year that is going to set a global record for heat. And now the headlines, even from normally cautious reporters like Brad Plumer at the New York Times, climate disruption is now locked in. And the metaphor is that scientists for a long time have talked about the possibility of cascading disasters happening at once, but now it's happening sooner than we thought. And especially for people that are living on the West Coast, for anyone watching the news coverage, or people who, if you know people on the West Coast, it's an amazing time, because this is not just the first fire season that this has happened. Is that this type of fire season, destruction and toxic air, is now been a seasonal event for the last 3 or 4 years. And an even bigger problem that we face now and into the future than the threats of pandemics, which others will occur, is how do we handle climate change, where this global shutdown of the economy, where no one was traveling, no one was driving, everyone was at home. It only resulted in between 5 to 7% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, which is a record. But again, it's not even close to what the IPCC says is needed on an annual basis to meet the Paris UN goals. So a lot of my research has looked at this this concept of framing, which directly relates then to also how do people frame their experience when they, or reframe their experience and their impression of the world through practices like meditation or Stoicism. And if you think about the complexity of the world around you, all the information, just your routine daily events, as you walk into a social situation, as you ruminate about the past or think about the future, much less try to deal with these historical moments that we're living through, you're always confronted with this uncertainty, really kind of these ambiguous situations in these events. And the context that you set within your thoughts, or the context that's set for you on social media or in news coverage or through conversations with a friend, that will, your perceptions of that complexity is context or frame dependent. So if you have this image on the screen here, and you might have seen different things when you looked at that image, but if I put 2 letters around it like that, what might seem uncertain to you now is very clear. This is resetting or reframing your impression of that information. And once I set that frame for you, it often becomes locked in. It's very difficult for me to shift your impression of that experience or that information, or that ambiguous stimulus that you're looking at. And that's often why people start to get sort of this train of thought around anxiety or nervousness or depression around rumination about the past, is that they can't break this cycle of thinking. And the same thing happens not just in people's daily lives, but also in politics and how we think about these super wicked risk-related problems that we face right now. Now, if I take that same image though, and I set letters around that, or numbers around that image instead of letters, what once looked to you as a B, now I've reset your frame of reference around that. And oftentimes when we practice meditation, when we practice yoga, when we practice various Stoic practices, which people are probably less familiar with. I practice yoga every day for at least an hour, and I'm trying to get back to a daily meditation practice. I find when I'm done with yoga, my frame of reference for the world or for a moment, or, thoughts I was having before I started yoga, are now reset, right? It resets my experience, my thoughts around a particular thing I was thinking about, whether it was a problem or something I was trying to solve or something I was worried about. That process of contemplation, that practice of contemplation, I think of yoga as meditation with breath or movement with breath. And oftentimes it's a really good time to meditate after practicing yoga, as many people have experienced. It resets your frame of reference for the moment, and it helps people cope with anxiety or depression. And again, as I'll talk about, the science around the impact is still very early, and it's very uncertain exactly how this works, whether it's effective, how it compares to other things. But at the same time, sometimes talking about the science of these practices can be a distraction and also take away from things that they can really teach us about the world, or about human experience, or about values, or about behavior, or what is a good society, or what is a good life. So if we look at what's happening right now, as people try to deal with the incredible uncertainty that they're facing, again, it's very difficult to measure this, but the Pew Survey Center did a panel design where they followed adults in March to look at their level of anxiety and stress. And about 33% of adults said that they were experiencing high levels of psychological distress in March or April. And there's a couple of things that's interesting about this finding is that, okay, there, all right, that you think about the difference between subjective perception and objective reality, and that relative to high levels of stress, there was really no relationship with the number of deaths in the immediate geographic surrounding. There was a strong relationship with financial distress, but in terms of sort of objective risks, say case counts or deaths around people, those that are experiencing the most amount of stress, it wasn't really that they were stressed about, or at least they may have a misaligned perception of their overall personal risk, perhaps. For example, you can see this difference with how concerned they are that they will get the coronavirus and require hospitalization. Again, this is the type of anxiety or rumination that often spills out of control and really creates a whole set of problems. But obviously the financial stress of 40 million Americans losing their jobs, that's probably one of the strongest levels of stress that you can experience. But what's interesting then is they asked people what percentage of US adults say they are doing each of the following during the coronavirus outbreak. And when they combine the measure in terms of either practicing meditation or yoga daily or weekly, you're looking at about 26% of Americans saying they're meditating. And I'll come back to that because that's actually something difficult to ask about in a survey question. And then 8% say that they're practicing yoga on a daily or weekly basis, and that differs by age. But you can see, unfortunately, that the number one tool for coping that people were turning to was watching TV or movies. And again, this is this other environment, the situational factor, this environmental factor that we live in now, that adds to anxiety and stress is our attachment to screens. And the total number of hours that we spend, 14 hours a day on average, looking at a screen. Again, you can look at some of the psychological research around binge watching related to anxiety and depression, or social media use related to anxiety and depression, and it's fairly compelling. So it's not like a constructive way to relieve stress if you're binge watching, adding even more screen time to your time. But this is remarkable. Even what's remarkable about this is that even pollsters thought to think about meditation and yoga in 2020. 5 years ago, 20 years ago, they wouldn't even have asked about it. And that starts to show you the increasing agenda status, the increasing salience or prevalence of these practices, that even pollsters are even asking these questions now. But when we break this down by different demographic factors, as the Pew Research Center did, you can see this. It's very difficult to ask about meditation in a population level survey, because for most Americans, for religious Americans, when you ask about meditation, they think about prayer or a particular teaching within their religious tradition, the Christian tradition, where meditation involves, as I understand it, as I've read about it, opening your mind to the divine. So clearing your mind so that God can, you can experience God directly, which is very different from mindfulness-based meditation or meditation from the Buddhist tradition. And as you look down here, then you can see then, if you look at the religiously unaffiliated people who say they're atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, this is where you're starting probably to try to, when people think about meditation among the religiously unaffiliated, they're probably thinking about mindfulness-based meditation. So it's difficult to unpack this even among the US population. Now, there aren't really even good studies around sort of estimates around daily practice, as I've kind of looked around, in part because people haven't had the money to really do it well. But you can also see that about 1 out of 10 so-called secular Americans are practicing yoga weekly or on a daily basis right now during the crisis. And then you can also then see that the highest levels of yoga use are among the young. And though there doesn't seem to be a huge difference about meditation, and for those 65 plus and older, those also happen to be the most religious in terms of church going and other things. So probably a big chunk of that 33% is Christian prayer, or how Christians would understand meditation. But one of the reasons why meditation and yoga is growing, and I'll come back to this towards the end when you start to think about theoretical frameworks for understanding this societal change and this uptake of Buddhist philosophy, yoga philosophy, Stoic philosophy and practice, as many of you know, is the increasing secularization of American society. So you can see in terms of this graph over time from 2007 to 2018-19, you can see a real rise in the number of people who say that they are nothing in particular in terms of a religion, whether they're even atheist or agnostic. And these percentages might seem small, but they do make a difference, because as you start to then translate this, as Pew does, into numbers of Americans, right? So numbers of Americans who self-identify as Christians has gone from 178 million to 167 million just in 9 years. The religiously affiliated, which is amazing to think about, has gone up almost by 30 million. So from 39 to 68 million. So now there's 30 million more Americans who are looking for, and this is also a major stressor and source of anxiety, because you have people, it's not just a belief system, but it's a institutional affiliation, a community that they are no longer part of. You know, most critics of religion think of religion as a belief system. I'm thinking about people like Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists and things like that. But what they overlook is that it's a social context. It's a community where people receive a lot of social support, a lot of social capital. Some of the research I've done with AAAS on science and religion, I wrote a report for them, and I'd like to put a graph in there from Robert Putnam that the volunteering rates and the civic engagement among people who regularly attend church are a lot higher than people who don't attend church. Why? Because church is an institution where you're constantly receiving requests to become involved. And there's teachings about and norm expectations about what you should be doing and what your level of involvement should be. And if your friends are also becoming involved or asking you to become involved in your community, you are more likely to do so yourself. And it's just not, for example, belief that leads to altruism. It's that social belonging and that bonding and that community that you have that then translates into works out in your community. And people are missing that now. And that's also why you're seeing a lot of increased in individualization. You're seeing a lot of alienation. You're seeing a lot of loneliness. It's all wrapped up in not only a loss of a belief system, but also a loss of an institutional situation and a community that has specific health benefits and certain social capital and community benefits, people to lean on that are not your direct family members, for example, in a time of crisis. What we're also seeing then is this secularization, this de-affiliation from religion is happening most prominently not surprisingly, among the younger generations. So you can see that among millennials, people who are in college now or into the early 30s, and Gen Z, it's probably even higher. 40% say that they're unaffiliated with religion. Gen X, which would be my generation, is 25%. And this is very different from the silent generation or from the baby boomers. Twice as many millennials say that they're religiously unaffiliated as baby boomers. And obviously hand in hand with that is that basically 64% of millennials say they don't attend church. So they're missing that community, and it's not clear what's replacing that form of community and that bonding and that social support. Most millennials would tell you it's social media or Facebook, but as we know, those are loose ties, and they come with their own other unintended consequences or negative impacts. Okay, so if we look at some of the, and this is something that over the last 10 years, as I've practiced yoga and meditation and just being intellectually curious, I've amassed sort of a middle-sized library around both classic and newer books about yoga and Buddhist philosophy, history, mindfulness, and more recently Stoicism. And as I read across the recent books about yoga and Buddhism and Stoicism, what I call the contemporary teachings, and then I search back and I try to look at some of these commonalities in the academic literature and the original text, I've started to pull out what I see as some common teachings. And again, this goes back to things like social psychology and cognitive psychology. Cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, was inspired by Stoicism, and now you'll see mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy, et cetera. And it goes back to what I was talking about with framing, is that it seems that these teachings and these traditions all share that the core problems of life are suffering and seeing reality clearly. And they teach us about the transitory, impermanent nature of our lives and the events around us, which also then helps us, for example, deal with thoughts of anxiety, for example, or worry about the future, or health conditions as it's been applied. And in the contemporary literature, the recognition that our perception of reality is clouded by not just the natural elaborate delusions we have. If you read Marcus Aurelius, or if you read the Buddha, they're always talking about these elaborate delusions that we are naturally prone to, but it's also made worse in today's society by a sort of a hyper-individualistic and consumerist society that's constantly bombarding us with information and messages about what we should want and what kind of life we should live and what we should be doing. And it's particularly a problem in sort of the elite meritocracy as well. When we think about people who go through the Ivy League or faculty, for example, as I've experienced, there's a great book called The Slow Professor, about the time pressures that faculty face, the constant pressure to always be productive and keep ahead, and the many different demands on time, and the drive to be perfect, because if you arrived as a professor at a lead institution, that's basically how you got there, is by always being perfect, by being a striver and a super achiever. And in the business literature, they talk about what they call an extreme job now. And many faculties work an extreme job, but for about 1/10 the pay of, say, an investment banker or a lawyer at a corporate law firm, that are working at least 70 hours a week, are expected to maintain work, after hours or over the weekend, are involved in multiple management roles, taking on huge tasks and juggling multiple projects at the same time. And so you see among mental health and burnout among the so-called elite professionals, you see it's very, very high. And that's much different than from the chronic stress then that people from low income and minority backgrounds face on a daily basis in living in poverty, and also dealing with issues like systemic racism. But it's at both ends of the class hierarchy and income hierarchy in the United States, that people are dealing with different types of chronic stress. And then finally, that confused thinking and suffering can be managed by a way of contemplation, self-mastery, and self-restraint. And so I'll come back to these in a little bit, but I wanted to talk about and show you something here. So, so one of the things that I can add to in the literature, and in my next slide, I'm going to talk to you about some theoretical frameworks and different slices, ways to kind of slice this idea of sort of the cultural uptake of, in this case, what I'm looking at first is mindfulness meditation. But this is just looking at what you see is something happened around 2010, 2012, where if the New York Times are paper of record with an elite readership, and also the New York Times is an agenda-setting publication, and that it's being covered at the New York Times, it's assigned to other publications across the country, magazines and newspapers, that this is a new thing, this is a social trend. This is a type of article that an upscale reader is interested in reading. And so you're looking here, it's two things happened. One is there was a huge spike in news coverage of mindfulness and meditation generally. But if you look at historically, what dropped out was any mention of Buddhism in the majority of articles starting right around 2015, 2016. And this is something that critics of the mindfulness movement have talked about, is that and I'll talk more about this, is that the mindfulness movement, in some ways, it's more palatable to the general public not to talk about it in the context of Buddhism, because it could be someone who's a Christian or someone who's an atheist who doesn't share an interest in religion or doesn't think of themselves who would participate in religious practice. If you secularize it, if you strip it away of discussion of Buddhism, then it allows a greater diffusion of the practice of mindfulness meditation. But at the same time, as I've come to learn, my first entryway into mindfulness meditation was reading Jon Kabat-Zinn, and he's an interesting figure in this. I'll talk more about it. But as I dug more into the reading and I practiced meditation, I found that absent a philosophical framework, meditation wasn't nearly as useful to me. It felt like a tool that I really didn't understand what it was doing or what the practice meant, and therefore, understanding its effects or even its meaning to me, or even consistently meditating. It was really by reading Buddhist literature and Buddhist philosophy that's what helped me reframe my experience and start to think about life differently and situations differently and live differently. And if I hadn't done that, I'm not sure whether meditation alone would have had the same type of effect. So in journalism studies and communication research, I could show you the exact same graph, and I could show you studies that I did on looking at news coverage of climate change, of food biotechnology, of embryonic stem cell research. In the sociology literature and the communication literature going back decades, this is called an issue attention cycle, that an issue, an emerging problem, an emerging trend, an emerging innovation, it goes through this long period of relative non-attention, where maybe experts are focusing on it. So there could be social entrepreneurs or advocates, and they're all sort of waiting around, looking for sort of this window of opportunity, which usually comes with some type of focusing event that then suddenly increases the relevance of that issue or the relevance of that practice, makes it more meaningful, makes it more newsworthy in particular. And allows journalists now to cover the story on an ongoing basis, rather than waiting for some type of episodic event, one-off event, like the release of a scientific study or a book or a documentary film that comes out. And so part of my analysis as I start to kind of map out this book is I'm working with an undergraduate at Northeastern, and we're going to dig in and do a systematic analysis of news coverage in the Anglo-sphere countries, to look at what are the drivers of this pattern of attention. And already looking at and starting to do the analysis on the New York Times, what you're seeing is this early coverage up through 2000. It's almost exclusively written by science journalists and religion reporters. And in all the coverage, it's mostly about some of the emerging scientific research around the effects of mindfulness-based meditation in dialogue with people like the Dalai Lama, for example. But starting in the early 2000s, that's when you see the story of mindfulness meditation no longer a science and religion story, but now it becomes a story about the workplace environment and the adoption of mindfulness and meditation as wellness programs at corporations. You're seeing stories about people going away on meditation retreats. You're seeing stories about celebrities practicing mindfulness and meditation. So it moves from being a science and religion story now to being a culture story, a style story, a travel story, a story that's being written about in the business pages, in the financial pages. And these are all cultural indicators of its wider diffusion, but also how mindfulness meditation, as some critics argue, as I'll talk about in a second, is sort of being co-opted by what they would say sort of our neoliberal society and by corporate America for various purposes, which I'll come back to. But I just want to show you a couple other things. So because if we start to dig into a couple other, oops, all right, I can't show you that. But if you, so I'll wrap up here in just a second. If you start to look into other databases, you see a similar pattern. Usually it's a leading pattern. So if I showed you the WorldCat database, which is a database of all the library holdings in the world, or the major libraries, both university and public libraries and government libraries, you see a similar issue. If I showed you the WorldCat database, which we're still kind of piecing through and cleaning up the data, you see a similar issue attention cycle, but it comes earlier in terms of a spike in the number of books that are being published around mindfulness, meditation, and Buddhism. And also you see a similar pattern sort of its secularization, where you see in the keywords around books that Buddhism drops out. And so the release of books is another indicator, a cultural indicator of this spread. If I showed you the scientific research and the number of studies that are being done both in the humanities and social sciences, but scientific fields, you would also see this, that this is emerging before this spike in attention among news coverage. And so as you start to look among the studies that have been done so far, and so there's a couple different theories and the books that have been published and the studies that have been published looking at sort of this uptake of mindfulness, meditation, and Buddhism, and some in a critical way. They kind of group around different theories. Sometimes they overlap. And the first line of theory is this secularization thesis, which is associated with Charles Taylor, and Francis Fukuyama talks about it in a book called Identity that's out now. And this is this broader explanation that there's been this, since the mid-20th century, this deinstitutionalization of organized religion, and also a movement away from other institutions, and it leaves individuals in search of new identities. And this, the critics look at this as towards the end of the 1960s in terms of the New Age and some of the other emergent movements, where people no longer identified themselves by the institution by which they belonged, but now by a particular racial or social identity or movement identity. This is a broader critique that what we're seeing now in terms of a lot of our politics is wrapped up in this idea of identity politics. And so there's people that this emerging people who don't identify with a religious tradition, the so-called religious nuns, they are N-O-N-E, not N-U-N, but they are searching for some type of meaning or some type of transcendence, something that, some type of ritual, some type of sense of belonging, and they're turning to things like yoga, or they're turning to things like meditation without really understanding maybe necessarily what they mean, or even without a community, because they're doing so by way of YouTube or over a mindfulness app. Another explanation that this is talked about is explanations about a risk society or social acceleration. This is a European set of theories by people like Ulrich Beck and Hermann Rusa. And so under this theory is that society around us is changing so fast. Not only are we coping with these sort of these new existential type of big problems like climate change or pandemics, but also just the speed of life that's transformed. And it throws everything out of order. We no longer have a sense of anchoring, whether it's changed everything about family life, about work. And this social acceleration effect also has a huge impact on this idea of self-improvement. And so, we're constantly, because we're always feeling that we're in jeopardy of falling behind, we're always looking for things like life hacking tools and ways to improve ourselves. And so you can see things like in corporate wellness programs or in Silicon Valley that people are turning to meditation and meditation apps as a way to improve performance, as a new type of super drug, as it's often referred to. Another approach to understanding the growth in mindfulness movement, mindfulness in particular, is to think about it as an elite social movement. It's a very good book by a sociologist at Hamilton College that came out last year, where you can think about the mindfulness movement as a movement. And if you're going to study a social movement, whether it's environmentalism or feminism or the mindfulness movement, what's different about the mindfulness movement, it's not a bottom-up movement, but it's a top-down one. It's a set of practices and beliefs that are driven by networks of fairly well-educated professional contemplative advocates. They might be educators, they might be scientists, they might be public intellectuals and authors, a particular network of foundations, and a particular network of organizations and corporations such as Google and their Search Within Inside You program. And that's the best-selling book on mindfulness over the last couple of years. Another approach is more of a very sharp critique, and this is the neoliberal critique. And there's two good books that kind of map this out. One is this book, Selling Spirituality, that came out a while ago. And then more recently, this book that got a lot of attention, McMindfulness. And in this case, they're talking about how, basically it's sort of neoliberal corporatism, pushing aside religious traditions that might be a source of source of challenge to the neoliberal system, and instead selling people on a version of spirituality where economics and marketing and commodification is no longer just taking place in what we think of as the traditional marketplace, but it has basically invaded every part of our lives. Things like branding and other things. And they match this also with things like religious studies and history of religion. It's an interesting critique. Two areas that are new and that I'm going to explore more and try to apply is, one is, this is a process of science popularization, where it's the translation of scientific findings, which then legitimates the practice of mindfulness or yoga in terms of its health benefits, its mental health benefits, et cetera. And it helps the practice then to become institutionalized. So if you're going to have mindfulness practice in a hospital or in school, you have to show scientific evidence that it works, and you can't talk about it as a spiritual or religious process. But in this process, you also then get a lot of elements of hype, because the research on mindfulness meditation and its effects is still very early. If I showed you a graph on the number of studies, it's actually only a couple hundred a year, which seems like a lot, but it's not compared to other fields. And then if you look at the really good studies that might be controlled experiments and sort of clinical trials, it's only a couple dozen that really fit that criteria. And then you're also looking at a lot of scientific uncertainty around replication in science generally, but but also in particular in psychology, where a lot of the research on mindfulness is happening. And then the final thing is really thinking about this as a process that's driven by huge transformations in media and technology. So even thinking about the growth in the 1990s, for example, of audio cassettes and CDs. So John Kabat-Zinn's innovation was that he took the experience of going on a silent meditation retreat and transformed it into a seminar where you would take over 12 weeks, but also you could take home with you then a cassette and a CD that you would then practice this guided meditation as some of the first guided meditations. And around that time in the 1990s, John Kabat-Zinn was on the Bill Moyers documentary series on science and spirituality. But you also had the emergence of the big box stores of Borders and Barnes and Nobles. And you also then, and what that meant was now people across the country, not just New York City or on the East Coast or the West Coast, but in the Midwest, you could go to these bookstores and be in an entire section where you would find books you otherwise couldn't find before the years of Amazon, for example. Books by smaller contemplative or Buddhist publishers like Shamala or Wisdom Publications. And then you had this huge magazine rack where you could go and browse the magazines and come across different magazines like Tricycle Magazine, which otherwise you wouldn't even know about before the World Wide Web or word of mouth, for example. Or if you or didn't already know someone who was practicing as part of a contemplative community. But then also the media and the technology, and this is my last point, Marshall McLuhan has a famous saying, the medium is the message, and his philosophy from the 60s and 70s, very convoluted. But there's an entire field of media ecology, and this makes sense, is that and we can see this in our lives, is that once a media changes, once we move from a print culture to a television culture, and once we move from a television culture to a social media culture, the way we access information, the way we read, the way that information is framed or translated, it changes that, and it changes even our thought patterns in terms of how we even think about the neuroplasticity of our brains, the difference between spending our life on screens and reading on screens versus reading in print. There's really good research on that. So as we start to popularize mindfulness meditation, for example, or yoga, the fact that you need to find a yoga video on YouTube, or you need to find a guided meditation on YouTube, the people who are making those videos, they have to conform that content to what that platform promotes, if people are going to find it, right? And that means that you see, the yoga instructors and others, that changes the nature of the practice itself and the content itself as it moves across these different platforms that select for different types of things. So I'll stop there because I know I'm over time, and I want to make sure that I get to hear people's thoughts and questions and comments and advice.
Thank you so much for this great presentation. And you have your work cut out for you, I guess. There are lots of aspects that can be analyzed, and this thing kind of amplifies itself, and you start thinking about all the other isms that come up right now, like social media as an autocatalytic engine that sort of explodes things out of control. So that's awesome. Let me see here. I do not see any questions yet from the audience. If you guys have any questions, we still have a few minutes to address them. And as we wait, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
And how do you see post-pandemic, because that was part of the title of the talk, how do you see post-pandemic this sort of boom in meditation and in yoga practices advance or not?
Well, I haven't seen any data on it yet, right? So there's like news stories and things like that. So what you're seeing is the collapse of the yoga community because the studios can't stay open, which means that people are going to be, this accelerates this process that was already happening, which was basically the digitization of yoga and meditation, where people are leaving face-to-face contexts to find a community and practice, to find an instructor or a teacher, and are now going online, right? So instead of going to your local meditation community for a meeting, now you're maybe using Sam Harris's app, and you're learning, and Sam Harris becomes your meditation teacher. Instead of your local meditation yoga studio owner and yoga teacher, now you have one of these YouTube stars that has 3 million followers on YouTube. Or you're using one of the streaming platforms now, which there's all sorts of everything from Peloton to yoga-specific streaming platforms. So that increases accessibility, but it completely erodes the institutions. And churches, traditional churches are facing the same thing in terms of you're going to see an even more decline in church participation because of this.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions from the audience. One is from Stephen Freiberg, and he's asking for a book list. So, I want to read so many of those books you mentioned. So I wonder if you could come up with a short book list, and we'll post that in our website.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's easy to do. Yeah, some great reading.
So that's a good one. And the other one is one from Silje Christensen. It says, thank you, Matthew. Silje here. I hope I'm not butchering your name.
So
For
yeah.
other communication scholars like myself, which research gaps do you see for us?
Well, Celia is my former postdoc, and she's one of the best in the world at large-scale content analysis of news coverage.
Okay.
And she's been doing some really interesting research, most recently on news coverage of sustainable food and climate change, but she's kind of a maestro in this area. Well, we should talk about it because it's really not something that's been studied by communication researchers with any type of systematic way or any type of quality. And I think there's some really good work to be done. So let's talk, Celia.
And we have an anonymous attendee here who asks if there are any good books about meditation that are neutral, meaning not promotional.
I'd have to think about that one. At most, and that's the problem with the scholarship, right? The research is that almost all of the scientific studies and the research is being done by meditation mindfulness practitioners who believe in its efficacy, which is good because they understand it, they're invested in it, they understand the community, they have access to the community, but also there's always researcher bias, and that's particularly a problem now in psychology generally. So, and that's why there's some skepticism. There's more and more emerging skepticism about the science that's been done, and it also then raises the question, though, under what conditions does the science matter to the practice, right? And I think it's because of that it needs to be legitimated to be used in health. It needs to be legitimated to be used in schools, and the way to legitimate something for a long time in our culture has been to show scientific proof, scientific evidence.
But I wonder if the person was basically saying, you know, where could I find a meditation book that actually goes directly to the sources and is not distilled by popular culture or commercialism? So sort of like the classics of meditation. I think that's more like it.
Right, and other people here, but I'll put that on the book list. But other people have some other here are some fabulous meditation teachers, so they probably have some good recommendations. So
true. And finally, if Zoom affects these issues, and you mentioned a little bit about yoga studios, it turns out that the yoga studio that I used to frequent, they do have online Zoom classes, you know, that a group of people do it together, you know, so.
Yeah, you know, I attended today's Upper Valley Zen Center meditation meeting at 11:30. And when I go back to Newburyport, I wouldn't otherwise be able to access the meditation meetings, which are almost every day. But now I'm looking forward to doing so, at least until they go back to face-to-face and don't offer Zoom anymore. So it does stretch access, but it also then, you know, particularly for yoga, I think it's so much easier just to now do some of the streaming platforms than to continue to go with your local yoga studio, mostly because of the production values, mostly because of the quality and some of the problems that the studios have. And then you're paying the same rates as if you were there in person. And I think so there has to be a real loyalty and community connection to continue to pay the same amount of money.
Exactly. Well, okay, I think that was our last question. So I'll thank Matt again. Again, for those who missed this will be uploaded in our website at ice.dartmouth.edu. And one final announcement, which is that on October 13th, we're going to have a public dialogue where I'm going to have Carol Cleland, who is a philosopher of science, and Bob Hazen, who is a leading astrobiologist, talking about something completely different, which is the question of what is life? How can we identify it potentially in other planets, and how can we define it, or should we define it? So October 13th, another live conversation. This one, I'm just going to mediate between a philosopher and a scientist. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you, Matt, again for this presentation. And
I appreciate the opportunity and being back here at Dartmouth. So it's been great.
Absolutely. And good luck with the book, and we'll keep in touch because you're right, supposedly next door to me. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye, everyone, and thanks for coming.